Hello Year 6 and welcome back to another art lesson with me, Mrs. Schofield. So today we're going to be looking at carrying out a study of a Picasso piece. We'll be drawing a picture which you can tell is a copy of a Picasso piece. We'll also be, most of you will be able to use accurate proportions and add the correct colours. And some of you are going to be choosing a more complicated Picasso picture and you're going to reproduce that accurately so that it looks the same as the original image using the same colour tones as well as proportions. So some of our keywords for today: reproduction or reproduce. The reason I've put the word reproduction is to try and make it clear to you that this piece, the study that we're going to carry out today, needs to appear when it is finished like a reproduction, like a photocopy of the original piece. And the reason why we're doing this is to practice our observation skills and our skills of proportion as well. So how well are we observing the original image, and are we looking at proportions? And in order to help us do that, we're going to study the original image, and we're going to be using our planning grids. Now, we have some examples of some finished pieces that were done from, by other students. We just take a minute to have a look at those. Those are examples of some Picasso pieces. Now, this is again a two-part lesson, so this is lesson 5. We'll do the first part this week and you'll do the second part next week. This week you'll be needing an A4 page, a pencil and a ruler, as well as a choice of one of the original images. Next week we're going to be adding colour. I don't want you to worry about that this week. So this week, just a pencil, an A4 page and a ruler. There we go. A4 page, pencil, rubber, ruler. Now Picasso, first of all, who was he and why are we studying him? So Picasso started off a bit like us. So the last 2 weeks we've been looking at our self-portraits and we've been looking at proportions. So he started off by drawing his own self-portrait, and he was obsessed with drawing himself accurately, and he practiced those skills over and over again. And over time he got so good at drawing himself using accurate proportions and very realistically that he got a bit bored with that style of art, and he started to think about other ways of creating self-portraits of himself, and this is what led him to the Cubist movement and to his abstract work. So if you look over here in the corner, you can see these are quite realistic portraits of himself, and then he moved towards the Cubist movement where he starts to abstract the original picture, so it doesn't look exactly like himself, but he still has those facial features. Now, he was born, I'll give you a minute to read this. His full name was Pablo Ruiz Picasso. He was born on the 25th of October 1881 and died on the 18th of April 1973. So he's a Spanish painter, sculptor, printmaker, ceramicist, someone who creates ceramics, and a theatre designer who spent most of his adult life in France. He is very influential, mainly for co-founding the Cubist movement, and as I said earlier, his abstract work led to Cubism. So these are 3 of Picasso's self-portraits which he created. I want you just to study them and decide for yourselves which one you are going to create a reproduction of today, based on which image do you think is the easiest to reproduce and which is the hardest and why. So have a little think about that, which is the easiest to reproduce and which is the hardest and why. I shall give you a minute. Easiest, hardest and why. Great. As you can see, Mrs. Schofield's made a little bit easier for you, and I've placed them in order from easiest to hardest. And I bet you came up with some of the same reasons that I came up with. So this one I thought was more basic shapes, less detail, slightly more detail, and much more detail and tone. So this third Picasso portrait is the most difficult. So choose carefully and wisely today. If you are still struggling with your proportions and using your grid and creating an accurate reproduction, think about how you managed the last 2 weeks task, then I would go for the easy image. Okay, if actually not too bad, you're doing okay, you're starting to understand proportions and you can still use the grid that you used in year 5, etc., then go for the middle one. And if you really want to challenge yourself today, then I would go for the third image. I have attached these images to the Google Classroom, so you can have them up on your screen while you're doing your work. Step 1. And you should be familiar with step 1. So when we're trying to create an accurate study of something, we use a planning grid to support us with proportions. I've answered the question that I have in the corner. Why do we use a planning grid? Can you remember what I just said? To help us with proportions. Fabulous. So I've gone, you can either use a 4-part grid or a 6-part grid. You can decide which type of grid you need to use based on your skills, based on your preferences. We're going to be starting with that, and I'm going to skip to show you what I've done and what I expect you to do today. So as you can see, it might be a little bit difficult to see. Let's turn a bit of an angle. There we go. I've used a 6-part planning grid. In order to do that, let me just give you a quick reminder. I worked out the halfway point of the page, which is approximately 10.5. I ruled a line down the middle. I measured the length of the page, which is approximately 30, and I divided the page into 3 10cm parts and ruled the lines across. And that's where I've got my 6-part grid. I then went and looked at the original image. I kept that on my screen. And that's why I'm not going to be modelling the whole process to you on the screen, because I actually have to have the picture on the screen myself. And I marked out points. I know you've heard of Mrs. Schofield before say to you, mark the points with things cross lines, cross the lines on that planning grid. And when I marked the points, I started to join that line. I started to draw in those basic construction lines. And when you've finished that, and you've drawn your entire image, just like I've done all the detail, everything. I'm ready for next week. I'm ready to add colour. I can say, yeah, I've done well, I've done it, I'm ready for the colour. When you've done that, you can go and rub out, erase, as I'm doing right now, those planning grid lines, so that you don't get confused what's the planning grid, which I nearly did, and what's actually my portrait, my Picasso portrait. So you can go rub out those planning grid lines. Okay, so let's go through those steps again, and then you're going to give it a go, which will be fabulous. Let's just get rid of this, shrink you down, and let's make that a bit bigger. So, step 1. You're going to be looking at the original image, decide which image you are going to draw today. You're going to select an image based on your skills. You're going to choose to use either a 4 or 6-part grid. You're going to use faint construction lines. So if you make a mistake, they are easy to erase and easy for you to correct your mistakes. You're going to draw that image as accurate as possible, creating a realistic reproduction. When you have done that, you are going to, and I should have added it and I haven't, you're going to rub out, bonus points if you remember to do this, your planning grid. When you've rubbed out the planning grid, you have finished all those construction lines. Your reproduction is ready for you to add colour to next week. You're going to upload it to Google Classroom so I can see how well you've done and how you've used your page. And then we are ready for next week. Now, next week we are going to start to add colour to our Picasso portraits, and you will need felt tips or coloured pencils. Have a think what you prefer. You might need to borrow them from someone, but have them ready for next week. I am very much looking forward to seeing your Picasso portraits. Hopefully you will find these a little bit easier than the self-portrait. So we started off with our self-portraits, and now we're moving on to abstract portraits, and hopefully you'll find it a little bit easier than last week. I look forward to seeing your work, Look after yourselves, have fun, and see you again soon.